It's February of 2025 and I want to buy a 5070 Ti. Well, too bad. It's out of stock, out of stock, out of stock, out of stock. Oh, $900. Well, I could bite the bullet, except, oh, that's actually out of stock too. Okay, so $1,000 plus for a 5070 Ti that's in stock. That seems pretty rough considering Nvidia said that they continue to ship all GeForce SKUs, and Asus retracted their having canceled the 5070 Ti and 5060 Ti 16GB, except in that retraction, they actually admitted that they have been temporarily affected for their production and output and restocking cycles, which may mean availability is limited in certain markets. In other words, they kind of just said, it's not end of life because we might at some point start actually producing them in reasonable quantities. So if you read into these statements, it's pretty clear what's really going on. Yes, gaming GPU production, especially on certain models, is at least severely limited in a lot of, if not all, markets. Now, today's video is focusing on the United States market, since that's where my primary viewers are at. I understand other regions could be different. And we're going to be looking at all of the GPUs from AMD, Nvidia, and Intel in the new market right now. Does anything make sense? And let's start in at the absolute beginning, because how about an RTX 5050, the lowest end Nvidia GPU in the current market? There's one model still available at its $250 MSRP, and then they jump up quickly from there, $260, $270, $280. Now, from there, we could jump up to an RTX 5060, which is supposed to have a $299 MSRP. The lowest price ones are available at $330, so these are already a minimum of 10% above their MSRP, and they go up quickly from there. Now, I should mention that if you don't need to buy a GPU right now, you probably shouldn't because prices suck. But if you do, you should check out the used market. For example, at Jawa.gg, I could spend $245 to get an RTX 3070, and if we check a relative performance chart, that's faster than not only the RTX 5050, which costs more than $250. In fact, we're about 30% more powerful than that. But even the RTX 5060, which is currently at $330, can only hope to match the performance of the 3070 in some specific games. The 3070 is generally a little bit more powerful than that too, although it loses out on frame generation support, although it supports AMD's frame generation. There's third-party frame generation tools. So really, if you're buying GPUs right now, the used market's a great place to check, and a huge thank you to Jawa for sponsoring this part of today's video. You can use code OWEN10 for $10 off your first purchase. Jawa is a market for gamers. You can get entire custom-built PCs in addition to used parts, and you can use their PC Finder to find exactly what you're looking for, performance in specific games at specific resolutions, get the exact parts that you're looking for, shop PCs by theme. You can also fund your upgrade by selling your hardware on Jawa. You can set your own prices and create your own listings, or you can take the maximum convenience offer by clicking the Get an Instant Offer button to sell your GPU or CPU directly to Jawa for cash. Again, there's tons of great reviews, and I am not kidding when I say that in the current market, the used market is the way to go because new prices are a disaster. Follow the sponsored link in the video description and or pinned comment to check out Jawa. Let's get back to seeing just how bad of a disaster the actual market is. So we already looked at the 5050, 5060. How about the 5060 Ti? Well, the 8GB version is available as low as $351, although that's a single model, and they're jumping up to $380 and then $400 plus past that point. So that's not looking great, and once you're starting to spend that much money, 8GB of VRAM starts to feel really bad. So how about we buy the 16GB version? $560. The MSRP models are completely gone out of stock. Even anything close to an MSRP model would be out of stock. And at this price, you might think, well, I should just get a 5070 since their MSRP is $550. Well, but I've got some bad news for you. The 5070 is now as low as $600 and is very quickly well above $600. But from this point, things get really bad because we've already mentioned the 5070 Ti, any actual availability is $1,000 plus. And then the 5080 is worse than that. The 5080 is supposed to have a $1,000 MSRP, but the only models that are actually in stock are well over $1,300. In fact, most of them are $1,400 or $1,500, so significantly above MSRP. And let's not even really talk about the 5090, because even at MSRP of $2,000, it's a lot of money and outside of most people's range. But the reality of the situation is there's only 2 models available below $4,000, and many models are available well above $5,000, which with some closing in on $6,000. So that's absolutely insane, and that is the current Nvidia lineup. In fact, it almost feels like the rumors that I had reported on previously came to pass. Nvidia, in its 8GB range, has prioritized the 5060 Ti 8GB above the other models when it comes to supply, because they make more profit and more revenue off of those 8GB modules when they're supply constrained. The 5070, we weren't sure what was going to happen with it. It's definitely above its MSRP now, and it used to be available, like sometimes you get flash sales down to like $500 or less. Now we can't find it below $600. The 16GB models, the 5080 is in stock, but extremely expensive. The 5070 Ti is only available if you go to $1,000, and the 5060 Ti 16GB is basically completely gone. So, did Nvidia and Asus lie? No, they just intentionally misled, because while saying that everything's fine, everything's still in production, they both actually still admitted that at least temporarily production output and restocking cycles have been affected, which will be limiting availability in certain markets. Nvidia says they ship all GeForce SKUs, but that doesn't mean in what quantity, right? And that they haven't prioritized certain models. So that is what's going on right now. And like I said, it is extremely hard to recommend any RTX 50 series product at the current prices. Like I said, the used market is a lot more attractive. For example, if you were going to get that 5060 Ti 16GB version at $560, you can get a 4070 on Java for $475. Now, if we check out the relative performance of those products, if we look at, let's see, 5060 Ti 16GB, set that as a baseline, that's right here. This is Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, by the way, that I'm using for this. It's not completely perfect, but it lines up close enough to my reviews that it's good enough for ballpark figures for today's purposes. The 4070 is actually more powerful than that by 15%. Yeah, it's 12GB instead of 16, but in the vast majority of 1440p gaming situations, 12GB does still get the job done, and it's actually just more powerful and costs significantly less money. So on the Nvidia lineup, there's really struggling to be anything to recommend in the new market, and the used market does seem to be the way to go. But now let's check in on AMD and then Intel. So what's the AMD situation? So the 9060 XT has an 8GB and a 16GB version. The 8GB version is available at $310, but then that's a single model, and then it jumps up to $334 and then $350 plus. That doesn't look great, especially considering you could get the 9060 XT 8GB as low as about $260 to $270 just a few months ago, so it's gone up significantly. But the 16GB model has jumped up significantly as well. Whereas I used to be able to find this as low as about $370, it's currently $440 at the lowest and very quickly goes up to $450 and above. Now, that being said, if you're not considering used market, this does beat the 5060 Ti 16GB pretty handily by about $100. So if you want to buy a new generation, new GPU that's above 8GB of VRAM and still has a lot of performance, the 9060 XT 16GB sort of gets my recommendation as far as like a hold your nose and I guess you could buy it. But like I said, for about the same price, you could get more performance from like a used 4070 or something like that. And then that also gets you the NVIDIA feature set advantage. So yeah, this is looking very, very rough here for these as well. Now, what about the 9070 class products? So the 9070 non-XT, $630, and then it goes up from there. and then the XT version, $730 for a couple of models, and then it goes up from there. Now, the 9070 XT had briefly hit its MSRP of around $600 on a couple of models for a little while there, but this is more similar to the prices we were seeing for a lot of last year on the XT version. The 9070 at $630, we had briefly seen it drop under $600, and then now it's back up to this again. Now, do these make any sense? Well, let's actually start at the top end here. The 9070 XT makes sense from a certain point of view. If you want to buy the most powerful GPU on the current market that doesn't have incredibly awful diminishing returns on price to performance, this is about where it tops out. Because the 9070 XT, from a performance standpoint, is a direct competitor with the 5070 Ti. Again, if we rely on the relative performance chart here from Tech Power Up, we see the 9070 XT, is a bit slower, but only by about 5% from the 5070 Ti. Now, in reality, it varies game by game. Sometimes the 9070 XT can even get a win. In path tracing workloads, the 5070 Ti is actually significantly faster. In standard ray tracing workloads, it's actually pretty close. Now, the Nvidia cards do have feature set advantages. DLSS 4 continues to get updates to like 4.5, even more image quality advantages, but FSR 4 looks pretty good. But again, Nvidia is still ahead with ray reconstruction, multi-frame generation, and you kind of get the feeling that Nvidia is going to always be pushing those features further while AMD kind of plays catch up. That being said, let's look at the actual price difference, right? So in the current market, the 9070 XT can be had for $730, whereas the 5070 Ti, as we already looked at earlier in the video, are about $1,000. So $1,000 versus $730, you have to ask yourself, does the Nvidia feature set advantage, is that worth 37% more money to you? Or again, about $270. Now, if you have a $1,000 GPU in your budget and you just want the best thing you can get for $1,000 or less, the 5070 Ti is a better graphics card than a 9070 XT, but only by a little bit. So if you're at all concerned about value, the 9070 XT at current pricing makes a much better deal. So I would say that if you want the best value high-end GPU on the current market, it's going to be the 9070 XT. But if $730 is hard to justify or hard to get, but you could hit $630, the 9070 offers similar performance per dollar. So let's check in on this. So $730 versus $630. The the XT version costs 16% more money. So for 16% more, you're getting about 12% more performance. Depends on exactly whose benchmarks you're looking at, but let's just keep using Tech Power Up to be consistent here. So they've got the 9070 XT about 12% more performance for about 16% more money. In other words, it's pretty much a wash from a performance per dollar standpoint. So basically, if you have the budget for the XT version, might as well get it. But if you don't, hanging back and just grabbing the non-XT version is certainly not a bad choice. You're not getting that much. You're actually getting slightly but hardly noticeably better performance per dollar, if slightly lower performance overall. These are also both 16 gigabyte GPUs, which, as we've seen, pretty hard to get a decent deal on those right now. Now, the 9070 is kind of in between the 5070 and 5070 Ti for performance. So it's also worth comparing to the 5070 non-Ti version. So the 5070 non-Ti version is $600 on a single model, and then they quickly jump up to $620, $630. So they're essentially the same price, although the lowest possible option does save you $30 on the 5070. So let's give them that. So you've got $630 versus $600. So you're spending 5% more money, and you're getting, let's see, I think about 10% more performance. Let's stick to Tech Power Up's numbers to be consistent for today. Yeah, so you're getting 10% more performance for about 5% more money. You're also getting 16 gigabytes of VRAM instead of 12, which is nice, but then you're also losing access to the NVIDIA feature set, which, again, so Okay, the 5070 at $600, that's a rough purchase because, again, you could have bought them for about $500 just a couple of months ago around Black Friday. But it's still only 50 over its MSRP, unlike the 5070 Ti, which is $300 over its MSRP, and same thing for the 5080, etc. So basically, I would say that if you want an Nvidia GPU, the 5070 is the last model that, like, the most powerful model that doesn't just have extreme diminishing returns. So from that standpoint, the 5070 is, I think, worth considering. And then the 9070, if you want that 16 gigabytes of VRAM, more so than you care about switching over to the AMD ecosystem, and you do also get a bit more performance, right? So from that standpoint, it's like the 9070 XT is the last powerful GPU that makes much sense. And then the 5070 is the last Nvidia GPU that makes much sense. By last, I mean like as you go up the performance stack. Now, like I said, as you go down the stack, it's really hard to be competitive with what you could do on the used market. So it's really hard to talk about. Also, as we go down the stack, we should probably bring Intel at least into the conversation. So where is the B570? The B570, it looks like there is one model available at $210, and then it jumps up to $250, but just not a lot of availability overall. One thing that's kind of interesting with the B570, at least, is that you are over 8 gigabytes of VRAM in a product class, or I should say like a price class where getting over 8 gigabytes of VRAM is pretty rare. So from that standpoint, the B570 might make some sort of sense. Let's see how it stacks up in like a performance standpoint though. So the B570 is similar performance to cards like the RTX 3060, which is a 12 gigabyte card. You might already have one, in which case it's like you're not even upgrading here. And again, on the used market, like I think I saw these at Jawa for about $210. So, okay, it's a used market card instead of a new market card, but a used 3060 is getting you about the same performance and more VRAM. And let's be honest here, while Intel's software stack, driver support, etc., has come light years from where it was when ARC cards first launched a few years ago, the Nvidia driver stack and software stack is still significantly better, and more consistent. Also, you could talk about CPU overhead situation, which Intel has been solving in many games, but not all of them. So yeah, Intel's come a long way, but I've got to say, I'd probably lean towards a used 3060 12 gigabyte rather than the brand new B570. That would be my preference. Let's see about the B580 though. So B580, at its MSRP of $250, you could like sort of consider it over a RTX 5050 if you weren't considering the used market, since it's like the B580 does have 12 gigabytes, but at $300 and then going up from there, that's getting a little bit rough. So yeah, I mean, if you're not going to consider a used GPU and you want to buy a $200 graphics card, the B570 seems somewhat interesting. So if you want a low-end new card, B570 worth considering. Other than that, things are pretty rough. So this is where we are at in February of 2026. And I've got to say that the unfortunate reality is that all of this stuff is happening because of memory supply, and there is zero signs of it getting any better, at least for the next year or so. Now, maybe there'll be some kind of AI market crash, and then the data centers try to back out of their contracts or something, who knows? But according to all of the information we have, memory supply is already contracted out, going out into 2027, and so things are not looking good. Are they going to get worse than they are now? I don't know. Are they? But it certainly wouldn't surprise me. Is it going to stay where it is? Maybe. If you're already happy with the graphics card that you have, you should probably stay with that if you could get a few more years out of it. If you have to upgrade, like I said, the used market is really presenting some interesting options compared to the new market right now. But I've given you my thoughts on the new market. Hopefully you guys found today's video useful and or interesting, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.